Yes, that's probably the question that I get asked the most as a riverkeeper. What's the progress? Is the river getting better? Is it healthy? Is it safe? And there's a couple of different ways you can look for signs of optimism. One is very scientific, and that is when you look at the trends of our data, most of our trend lines have an upward trend, which is an exciting thing to see. We have been collecting between the legacy organizations that formed Shore Rivers and now Shore Rivers. We have, in some cases, 30 years of data going back on all of these rivers that we serve, which is fantastic for us to get these baseline indicators of where we were, where we want to go. An important thing to know is that nitrogen that comes into our rivers, which is one of the number one pollutants we're battling, comes in through groundwater. And it takes between 20 and 50 years for that nitrogen to filter down through the groundwater and come into our rivers. And so we're seeing nitrogen levels today in our rivers that mostly have come from land practices from 20 to 50 years ago. So we know that restoration works and that the land within our own watershed is primarily what's contributing pollution to our local rivers. So the restoration projects that we're putting in the ground within the Chester watershed are helping to reduce pounds of nitrogen annually that are going down into that groundwater, and that equals a better result. But we have to be patient to see that kind of outcome. We can also see signs of optimism in a day-to-day basis if folks are out on the river to see it. And this is something that I've been advocating for long before I was the riverkeeper and I was just an experiential educator on the Chester River, on the Chesapeake Bay, where my job was to connect students to this incredible resource and get them to see how much life is thriving here in spite of all of the challenges that having an incredibly populated watershed that is the Chesapeake Bay throws at it. So, we can see that when we are scouting for SAV beds. So SAV is submerged aquatic vegetation. That's those underwater native grasses that we want to regenerate in our rivers. There aren't as many as there used to be, but they are coming back. We're seeing a resurgence. And our goal is to restore the Chesapeake Bay's water grasses to about 185,000 acres across the bay. Shore Rivers is working to do our part on our water, on our rivers. And when we send our volunteers out in these rivers to scout for these beds, when you come across beds of thriving grasses, so in our case, that's Grayson Creek, Swan Creek, we have some in Southeast Creek, historically in the upper Chester near Crumpton, we have some thriving grass beds. And when your kayak glides over top of that grass bed, the water quality changes instantly. And you can go from seeing, 1 to 2 feet of clarity to 3 to 5 feet of clarity. You see biodiversity of, crabs, fish, and you see what the rest of the river wants to be if we can help it get there. And so there are times when you're out recreating and you're seeing, maybe 10 bald eagles in an afternoon when 20 years ago we weren't seeing, any bald eagles. We're seeing a biodiversity of animals along the shore. We're seeing days of incredible water quality, some days not so great water quality. Of course, that all depends on how much rainwater we're getting. But if we're all out there engaging with our rivers, there's plenty of signs of optimism where we can see this is what we're shooting for. This is what we want to see everywhere in the river every day. And we are getting there. And that's through awareness from our citizens and enforcement for permit holders and players in our watershed that are contributing pollutants, and it's through time and restoration practices. We know that pollution is coming from within our watershed. We have this external factor of climate change that's changing how our watershed interacts with local waterways. And so with climate change, we're getting impacted in two main ways, and that's sea level rise and increased frequency of storm activities. And not only are those storm activities more frequent, they're also more intense in nature. You're getting a higher amount of rainfall per storm, which equals a higher amount of erosion, which is, of course, our number one kind of pollutant carrier is land erosion. And so with sea rise, we are doing a tremendous amount of work with our outreach to planning departments, counties as they update their comprehensive plans, municipalities, how when the sea level rise that is inevitable is coming, we don't know how bad it will be. Is it going to be 1 foot, 2 foot? Is it going to be 5 feet? We don't know. There's a lot of factors still up in the air there. But when this sea level rise comes, how's that going to impact the infrastructure that's next to the water? And if we don't, plan for that, and that's going to be flooding our sewer lines, that's going to be flooding our impervious surface, which of course accumulates bacteria levels and different pollutants itself, whether that's from, motor vehicles, whether that's from litter, whether that's from microplastics, whether that's from, kind of nutrient bacteria. That's all when those floods happen because of that sea level rise. That's all being absorbed back into our waterway. But that's also impacting communities. It's impacting septic systems that are in a relatively shallow water table. When we think about places like Kent Island that have sandy soils, shallower water tables, a lot of marshy land, they're going to be one of those first communities to feel those impacts of, sea level rise in the Chester. And not only that, this transitional land, this marshland that we have so much of in the Chesapeake will also go somewhere. It's not as though we'll just lose marshland. Marshland will migrate. And so we have to be prepared to plan for that movement as well. And that's so important that we protect that transitional land as much as possible, because that's nature's way of filtering out all of the nutrient pollution that we have coming off of hard land into our waterways. It slows everything down. It gives all of those plants a chance to absorb the runoff, and then it hits our waterway. And so we can't afford to lose that either. So planning for all of that kind of migration, whether it's actual water or marsh, is very important. But of course, these frequent rain events and this warmer temperature is impacting agriculture. It's obvious that on the Eastern Shore, we have a lot of agricultural activity. 65% of our land use is in ag. In Kent and Queen Anne's County, you can probably raise that percentage. And so with every rainstorm, we have soil and amendments that can be lost in those rainstorms, which means maybe farmers are applying more regularly, more frequently, because they've lost those amendments that they've invested into their fields. It, of course, is upping erosion in general across all land uses, and it's flooding wastewater treatment plant systems that are outdated, septic systems, those types of things. So it's definitely having an impact. It's increasing the pollution that we're seeing, and that's why it's more important than ever to prioritize those restoration efforts, because again, we're only going to get wetter and wetter with every year, and we want to mimic a dry year as much as possible with these restoration projects. The bacteria, it's important to always explain that the bacteria that we're monitoring for in these bacteria tests is fecal enterococci. So it's a bacteria indicator. We're not checking for Vibrio. We're not checking for a flesh-eating disease. We're not talking about live E. coli. We're talking about a fecal indicator that's a result of nutrients going into our waterway. So it's another feather in our cap for measuring nutrient loads that are coming into our bodies of water. Having said that, drinking water with any kind of bacteria levels in it can make you sick. And of course, we want to be sure that folks who are recreating in the Chester are doing so fully informed. And what I love about this program and what I love about the response we get from the bacteria program is that this does hit home for folks, because everyone deserves to be able to recreate in these waterways. And everyone who lives in this area and has a connection to the Chester, it's likely because they love to recreate in the Chester. We want them to be able to keep doing that. And, I've spent my whole life swimming in this river. My child swims in this river. I don't plan on stopping anytime soon, and every single person that works at Shore Rivers would tell you the same. So this is not a tool to scare folks away from our waterways. This is a tool to bring them in, to engage them on what's happening in our waterways and let them know when and where are the best times perhaps to engage in recreating in our waterways. It's also an important tool to lead us toward possible nutrient polluters. So Shore Rivers is engaging in source tracking, which is another set of DNA testing that we can do alongside of our bacteria tests, which can help us understand where this bacteria is coming from, what animal. Is it coming from chicken? Is it coming from cow? Is it coming from sheep? Is it coming from human? And that allows us to start figuring out, okay, it's no secret on the Chester that Morgan Creek is one of our highest failing tributaries, sub-tributaries to the Chester week after week. And so can we figure out if there's one major trend in the source of bacteria pollution that's coming into Morgan Creek, and then Shore Rivers can work to build a plan to reduce that. So the information is incredibly valuable for us. We're starting to be able to put together a story that maybe allows us to take our enforcement to the next level. But mostly what people can take away from our bacteria data is this. After a major rain event on an outgoing tide, our sites are likely to fail. They are 50% more likely to fail when it's a major rain event and an outgoing tide. And what I mean by fail, those standards are set by the EPA, and it's based on safe swimming guidelines that their department sets. So anything above 104 coliform forming units is a fail in their book, and we are simply relaying that information. This isn't a designation that Shore Rivers creates.